A very big welcome to you all to Father's House 2021 Holocaust Memorial Service. And it's really very sad that we can't meet together in person, but it's great that we can film this and bring this virtual memorial service to you, because it's really important that we don't pass it by and that we actually remember those who died in Holocaust and also those who survived Holocaust, who have faced many traumas and many issues in their lives because of the experiences that they had during the Holocaust. And our exhibition, as you can see behind me, has been held for nearly 20 years now, and we've held it in various towns in North Wales, but also in Liverpool. We've housed it at Liverpool Cathedral and at Liverpool Town Hall for a number of years. And then 2 years ago, we brought it back to North Wales so that we could teach the people of North Wales about Holocaust. And we've found it's been a really important part of our work here in North Wales to teach Holocaust and reach out to the children, particularly in the schools here. And one of the schools here is Queen's Ferry Primary School, which is close by to our congregation. And they've been an integral part of our Holocaust Memorial Service since we brought it back to North Wales. And I want to thank Mr. Richard Thornhill for his work in teaching the children Holocaust and bringing them to the exhibition. And we've also had children from the special needs school in Flint coming to the exhibition, and other school children, but we've also had many adults coming and playing a part in learning about Holocaust and spending time with this exhibition. So it's been a worthwhile experience for us all. And it doesn't stop, because here tonight we are going to remember the survivors of Holocaust, and we're going to be speaking to people who will bring to us real life stories. And one of those people is Lord Alex Carlile, whose mother was not only a survivor in Holocaust, but also a rescuer. And we're going to hear the story about Frederica and the important role she played in Holocaust to rescue someone who became Lord Alex Carlile's half-sister, Renata Calverley. And it's an amazing story. But we also have pictures and stories from Holocaust survivors in Israel who are cared for at this time by Susan Heagy of Abundant Life International, which is a ministry caring for Holocaust survivors in the Haifa area. And we have pictures, photographs of two of those survivors and stories of two of those survivors, which are going to be read by two young ladies, Beth and Sophie Eassom. So you will see these photographs and you will hear the stories about these two survivors who Susan is caring for in Haifa. And the photographs were taken actually by my daughter, Grace Fryer, and Reed Vickers, who went to Israel just before lockdown in January last year, and spent time taking photographs of survivors. Both Grace and Reed Aaron Vickers have first-class honours in photography, so they have taken beautiful pictures of survivors, and those pictures have been edited by them since. They took them on 35mm film, so it's a warmer picture, much more professional, and they're brought to you tonight to show you the faces of those people who survived the trauma of Holocaust and are bringing to us today a message, a really important message. So tonight we have a number of speakers as well who are connected with Holocaust education, and I'll introduce these speakers as we go along. Stephanie Kaye and Ephraim Kaye, who are retired from Yad Vashem but are now independently working as Holocaust educators. I'm excited to introduce them because they taught me about Holocaust and at Yad Vashem, and I can't thank them enough for the work that they did. And also we've got Jack Sargeant, the Senedd member. Senedd is the Welsh Assembly, the Welsh government. And Jack, as a member of the Senate, has been to a number of our memorial services here. He's a really a big friend of the exhibition, and he comes usually with his mum and another representative. But we're going to welcome Jack tonight to be a part of this service, because we think a lot of Jack Sargeant and the work that he does on behalf of many people who have suffered from abuse and trauma, and he's a politician who fights for kindness in politics, so he's quite a guy. And we also have Mark Tami, whose son has a real interest in Holocaust, and Mark is passionate about Holocaust Memorial and really wants to see the putting aside of hatred towards any people group, particularly anti-Semitism, within his own political party. So we're going to hear from all these people. But what I want you to do, though, is to hear the stories from all these representatives of Father's House here tonight, and to take it all in. We're going to be hearing music by Ruth Vazal, who is an amazing violinist, and we're going to spend just some time listening to Ruth Vazal. But I think the important thing is that we listen and learn from the stories of the survivors that we will hear tonight. And one of the terms that we use today in Holocaust is, why do we need to remember Holocaust? And the reason we need to remember Holocaust is so that, of course, we don't allow it to happen again, but also we need to remember Holocaust so that we can root out the hatred which is again bubbling up in many areas within society throughout Europe. And we need to stand strong, unified in the fight against hatred towards all people groups, but particularly towards the Jewish people, who have tried to walk with integrity and bless many nations, and yet have been abused by those nations and have been persecuted, and as we see from Holocaust, actually murdered en masse by ordinary people. Now, you may say, why is a church standing out and speaking out against Holocaust? Well, it's true to say that for 2,000 years, in the name of Christianity, Jews have been persecuted by the church right throughout history. And in the years just prior to the war, the church, particularly in Germany and Austria, under the banner of the German Christian church, actually fueled the hatred, which created an atmosphere in Germany whereby ordinary men and women believed they were doing the work of God by killing Jews. That's very, very hard for us to understand today, to even think about how that psyche could be created, but it was created because of the speaking of hate. And our exhibition starts with the 8 stages of genocide. And those 8 stages of genocide are applicable to all genocides, but particularly they are relevant to Holocaust because it was ordinary men and women who spoke with hatred towards the Jewish people that incited hatred. And of course, what Hitler did, and this is my personal view, what Hitler did was simply turn the key to the anti-Semitism, which was already at boiling point within Europe. And he used the hatred that had been taught in the churches and other organizations to eliminate the Jews of Europe, or try at least to eliminate the Jews of Europe. Is that important for us in the UK? Yes, it is, because Hitler wanted to not only to murder the Jews in Europe, the 6 million, but he had listed 11 million Jews as targets for mass extermination. And some of those were Jews living in the UK, just over 330,000 at that time. So had he have won the war, the Jews in the UK would have also been exterminated. And we would hear from people like Lynn Julius, who runs an organization called Harif, that, and we see in her book Uprooted, that those Jews in the Middle East would also have been targets of Hitler and his regime. So there's a lot of work to do. So I just want to now at this stage to invite you to listen to Jack Sargeant. Jack, I welcome you to tonight's service, and we're really blessed by you and your team and all the work that you do on behalf of us here in the Senedd. So I welcome you, Jack Sargeant, member of the Senedd of Wales. Thank you, Jack.
Hello there, I'm Jack Sargeant, the member of the Senedd for Allen and Deeside in North Wales, and I'd like to thank Pastor Michael and those at Father's House for giving me the opportunity to record this message for the virtual Holocaust Memorial Service. Sadly, unlike previous years, we cannot gather together for this important occasion. Nonetheless, it is as vital as ever that we continue to remember and educate one another on the dangers of discrimination, racism, and hatred. Each generation has a responsibility to teach the next about what happened during the Holocaust. A responsibility to tell the next generation of the people who suffered and who were murdered, so that their story and who they were is not forgotten. Millions of innocent lives were taken, in itself a horrifying number to comprehend, but we also must not forget the individual stories behind this. Like Anna Lenkering and Helena Melanie, two of the 250,000 people murdered by the Nazis because they were physically or mentally disabled. Or Philip Manns, a German Jewish World War I veteran murdered in Auschwitz in 1944. In January of last year, we marked 75 years since the liberation of Auschwitz. Henry Kitchker is one of the dwindling handful of men and women who survived the camp. As he told the BBC of the horrors he witnessed, he explained he is happy to talk about the things he would prefer to forget, if it means that the rest of us remember. Time may pass, but we cannot allow these people to be forgotten. Their stories teach us important lessons, lessons that still need to be learned from today. Shamefully, anti-Semitism is not simply a problem of the past. It even exists in my own political party, and that needs to stop. Those responsible have no place in the Labour Party. From the time they assumed power in Germany in 1933, the Nazis used propaganda, persecution, and legislation to deny human and civil rights to German Jews. We must never allow the rhetoric of hatred and discrimination to go unchallenged. It must be called out in all its forms, whenever it occurs. When racism becomes socially acceptable, prejudice is allowed to flourish. We cannot allow that to happen. So today is our opportunity to honour the millions who lost their lives in the Holocaust, to pay tribute to those like Henry who survived, to promise to never forget, but also to never end the fight against the scourge of anti-Semitism, racism and prejudice, and to remember that the power of kindness in overcoming hatred and forging a better world for us all. So please, take this message. Be the light in the darkness, and call out hatred when it occurs, and practice kindness each and every day. Thank you very much. Diolch yn fawr iawn. Stay safe.
Thank you, Jack. I really appreciate your input into our memorial service. Now, I'm going to show you a picture now, and I hope you can see it on the screen, but it's a picture of a mother holding a young child. And she's in the pits in the killing fields in a place called Trostenest in near Minsk in Belarus. and she's about to be shot by soldiers who you can see, just about see in the picture. And the picture was given to me when I visited Minsk by a professor of Minsk University, a man named Vladimir, whose parents were killed during the Holocaust. And he pointed out to me that ordinary men could even stoop to the level of killing a mother who was holding a child in the pits themselves. And this took an extraordinary situation into something which was already horrific. So I just wanted to point that out to you, because I know our next speaker, Mark Tami, cares very much about people, ordinary people, and cares very much about trying to stop the teaching of hatred, of anti-Semitism within his own political party, the Labour Party. So Mark, I'm going to introduce you now, and thank you for coming and speaking at our memorial service. So Mark Tami, our local MP. Thank you.
I'm just sorry I cannot be with you in this very difficult times that we have, and I hope we mostly get back to normal as soon as possible. I think it is so important that we learn the lessons of history, none more so than the Holocaust. And I think it's important that we really remember that the Holocaust didn't start with the Second World War, or indeed finish with the Second World War. The seeds of the Holocaust were sown centuries before, and not just in Germany or Eastern Europe, but actually throughout the world. And we have to look at ourselves as well, at our own history, about how we have treated the Jewish people, and indeed even today, how people still use language and that is offensive, is hurtful, and actually to me that's where much of the hatred that we see actually starts with. Casual anti-Semitism, and when people say, well, it's only words, it's only language, it doesn't really hurt anybody, but it does. And casual language actually leads to people actually believing it is acceptable to use it, and that leads to somehow that violence becomes acceptable. Well, it isn't acceptable, and we need to point out to people, shout it out when it actually happens, because the dangers are there for us all to see. And yes, in the past we saw occasions where there were pogroms, even the Crusades, or going back in history, saw faiths just told that they were to blame for all the ills in the world. And there are still people today that will use that very simple political message, and to many it is still attractive. So it needs to be called out, it needs to be shouted out, and we need above all to actually remember what happened, because casual words lead to casual violence, and in the Holocaust we saw what it ended in doing, which was the systematic murder of millions of people. And it could happen again, and we have seen throughout the world where people are being targeted because of their faith, because of that they happen to live in a different place or a different class. And we really need to learn the lessons of our history, and that is why it is important that we need to teach about the Holocaust to all school children and indeed to adults. So I hope that this message will get to people, and people will really understand what the importance is. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Mark. I really appreciate your input into our Holocaust Memorial Service. The next person I want to introduce is a lovely, gentle lady, an American lady who moved to Israel some years ago, to work with Holocaust survivors. And she's going to tell her story now and talk a bit about the survivors that she looks after. And her name is Susan Heagy, and she started up a ministry called Abundant Hope International. And we're going to be asking for donations at the end of this memorial service. And some of those donations will go towards Susan's ministry in Haifa, and all that money will go to support Holocaust survivors in the Haifa area in Israel. And also we'll be asking you for donations as well to a mental health charity here in the UK, which was founded by our final speaker, Lord Carlile, to help young people through the difficulties of mental health. So those are the two things that we are asking for donations for. But first of all, for Abundant Hope International. So Susan, if I can introduce you now, and thank you for being part of our service, but also thank you for helping us all to connect with Holocaust survivors in Israel. Susan Heagy.
Hi, my name is Susan Heagy. I'm here in Israel with Abundant Hope International. It's an organization that started when I first came here in 2004. The purpose? Holocaust survivors. I knew nothing about them when I arrived, but I have certainly learned through the Lord what it is that He feels about them, which He loves the survivors so much. Holocaust survivors, it's over 75 years ago since the war is over, but we have 189,000 here in Israel, still today. But they're dying one every 30 minutes. Our time with them is very short. Our time with them is very precious. What can you do for Holocaust survivors? Well, we have found that it has changed quite a bit over the years. In the beginning, I was visiting and recording what it is they had to say about their account, everything that happened to them in the war. Sometimes they wouldn't want to talk, and it's okay, because I just came to see them. What was I doing there with them? The Lord told me I was to hug them, kiss them, love them, tell them that He loves them, and that's all. Just to give them honor and love, compassion. He said, come with a passion for my people. And so that is exactly what we do. The passion of loving them is so amazing. For me especially, because I never wanted to work with old people. In fact, I told the Lord, I'll do anything for you, just don't give me old people. And He gave me the oldest in the world. But along with that, He gave me an incredible love for them. And the people that come and meet them, which I invite you as well, to come and spend time with us, to meet survivors, to talk to them, to touch them, because that's what they really need. They need a touch, and they need to know that someone cares. I actually went to see a couple survivors from Greece, and they had been wealthy, but when the Nazis came, they literally came in their front door and the family ran out the back. They left with nothing but their clothes. And when I went to see them, after a while she said, I don't understand, why are you here? I said, we want you to know that we care about you. And she began to cry. She said, I didn't know anybody outside of Israel cares. Can you imagine people not understanding any care from anyone, that they are so much on their own? But that's exactly what it's like today. These Holocaust survivors are lonely, terribly lonely. In fact, the loneliness, God told me, it's like a thick water that you walk through. It's almost like jello. You can feel it. It's tangible. And I asked Him to explain it to me. He said, Psalm 68, 5 and 6, a father to the fatherless. You see, they're all fatherless. Most of them, their parents were killed in the war. In fact, most of them saw their parents killed in the war. So they are fatherless, a defender of widows. Many of them today have lost their spouse and they're alone. Is God in His holy dwelling, He sets the lonely in families. What does that mean? Well, if you have an orphan, that orphan needs to be put into a family. And that is exactly what we do. We have a program, Adopt a Survivor. because we want you to be able to be part of their life. We want you to be their family. Tell them about your vacation, your dog, your cat, your children. Tell them how you love them. Encourage them. This is what they need to hear. And let me tell you, when they receive a letter, and we get the letters first, we translate them into their language, whether it's Russian or Hebrew or Romanian, German, we get them translated so they can read them later on their own. And when they get a letter, they are so excited. And they read that letter over and over. And as they fold it back up, they put it on the sofa beside them. And it just stays there, and the stack gets higher and higher. And when you come in, look what I got. I got another letter. They forget that we're the ones that are translating. They're just excited to tell us. What else can we do for them? Birthday flowers, birthday cards. Imagine never receiving birthday flowers or a birthday card. Many times we go in to see a survivor and our birthday card is sitting there. It's the only one they got. Maybe 3-4 years later, there's 3 or 4 cards. They keep them sitting out so they can see them. When we bring the flowers, they've gotten used to it here in Akko, which is where we're located. They are looking forward to it. In fact, they stay home on that day, waiting for you to come. And when you come, it's big smiles and hugs. Except for with the COVID. With the COVID-19, it's changed everything for them. We have not been allowed to touch them. We have not been allowed to go see them. So what could we do? This is the basis of everything we do. Loving on them. Did you know that you can love somebody from the street waving at them in the window? You call them up and they come to the window, and you wave to them and you blow them kisses. It makes their day. But now when we take flowers to them, it's relaxed a little bit. The lockdown isn't quite so bad. But there's one lady that I took to a couple weeks ago, and I just felt so bad. We're not allowed to touch them yet. She had on a mask, I had on a mask, and I handed her the flowers, and she reached out and she just touched my hand. And I heard a big sigh. She just needed to touch. This is so important for them. You know, one of the first survivors that I heard a story from was when God really showed me another part of that verse that I told you earlier. Her name was Anna. And Anna was a soldier in the war, a Russian soldier. She was Jewish. She was a nurse. A nurse in the war at the front line meant that you had a gun in one hand and a medical bag in the other, and you fought. And when somebody beside you was injured, you put your gun down and you helped them, and then you started fighting again. Well, she was wounded and captured and put in a ghetto. When she got out, she and her husband came to Israel. Right after they came, he died. She was alone. Well, now, years later, she had developed something in her spine that she was bent over and could not stand up anymore. She moved very slowly and very painfully. We asked if we could pray for her before we left. It's the first time we met Anna. She said, yes, please. So we prayed. And I asked for the God of Israel to heal her back. We came back about 6 weeks later to see her, and we were surprised to see her run through the house and open the door. We would like to be able to start providing social workers who will go in and help them, caretakers. This is what they need. They need to be cared for and known that they're loved. But we want to be able to train people properly. We have many things that we would like to do for survivors. We have other projects in the works. But I can tell you that we are supported only by individual donations. We need them. The survivors need them. Because everybody in our group is volunteer. I'm a volunteer, everyone. All of the money, 100%, that is given for survivors goes to them. It's only right. It's only proper. We have right here in Akko, I have 282 that we see on a regular basis. And we have almost 1,000 survivors total all over Israel. We do what we can for them. We call them up, we see them, we visit, we provide. But we can't do it without you. And so I would really like you to be able to go to our website, www.ahi-il.org. Go on there, read, see what's there. If you feel the Lord's telling you to donate, we'd appreciate it. Otherwise, contact us if you would like to write to a survivor. Or if you want to come, please come. We would love to have you here. The survivors love it when we bring someone. They say, "Who do you have today? Where are they from? What country?" They get so excited. Let us share that excitement with you. Time is short. This is a limited time offer for you. Please come and be part of what we do. Thank you.
Thank you, Susan. That was really informative, and it's great to hear that people still care about Holocaust survivors and still care about people in their old age as well and look after them. So thank you for being a tool really for us to support Holocaust survivors. Thank you, Susan. Now the next guests I want to welcome are Ephraim Kaye and his wife Stephanie Kaye, and they have inputted into my life, not only in regards to Holocaust education, but in regards to the way that we teach Holocaust, because I studied under both of them at Yad Vashem. They were the international directors of education at Yad Vashem when I did my courses at Yad Vashem, and they were totally committed and passionate to teach people in the nations like myself about Holocaust so that we can go on and teach it to others. And they are wonderful teachers, absolutely amazing. They're dear friends. They are very, very special people, both now retired from Yad Vashem, but actually are independent educators now. So they travel the world and speak about Holocaust and aspects of Holocaust. And Stephanie has actually been here to Father's House, and this time last year was teaching Holocaust to many groups in Wales, the UK, and parts of Ireland as well. So I want to thank you both for inputting into this memorial service. And both Ephraim and Steffi will be speaking about survivors. So there are two 10-minute videos, one from Ephraim and one from Steffi, which I know you will enjoy. And I'm so glad you can meet them and hear the way that they educate in the way that I did many years ago at Yad Vashem. So thank you to both of you, very special friends at Father's House.
Shalom to Mike and to Shirley, to Rebecca and everybody at Father's House. Both Sophie and I are happy to take part in this commemoration of the 27th of January. And the two survivors that I've chosen to speak about, you see them on the screen here, Nachum and Genya Manol. And I'm going to tell you a very short love story about these two survivors. This is already 14 years ago. Nachum today is 96. Genya is 93. Thank God, they're both still healthy. They live today in an old age home in Beersheba. But originally, they're both from Krakow in Poland. That's where they're born and grew up. And they met each other for the first time in Schindler's factory, the Email factory in Krakow. Nachum, he was a car mechanic that worked on the cars there that belonged to the different administrative officials there, Germans. And Genya worked in Schindler's factory together with her father, mother, and brother. Schindler sometimes took entire families, including small children, to work in his factory. And there they met. He was 23, she was 22, she was 17, 18 years old. And he had then red hair. You don't see a lot of hair now, but he had red hair. And he had books and it became sort of a lending library. There were men and women that worked both in the Emile factory that Schindler had, producing these pots and pans for the German army. And Genya took an interest in the books, although between us, she wasn't very interested in the books. She was more interested in Nahum. And as their romance developed, Nahum turned to Genya and said to her, if we survive, I want to marry you in a small town outside of Tel Aviv called Givatayim. Interesting, why there of all places? And it goes to Nahum's personal story of his family, that he comes from a very Zionistic family, and the family, father, mother, 3 children, in the 1920s, during what we call the fourth Zionist wave of immigration to the British Mandate of Palestine, they left Poland and came to the land of Israel in a small town outside Tel Aviv called Givatayim. Father built a home for the family, and that's where they lived in the 1920s. 1930, 31, there was an economic depression worldwide, but also affected the British Mandate in Palestine. Father had no work, apparently still had a business in Krakow, and he decided to go back to Poland. Now, most Jews didn't do that. He reached safe shores, he stayed there, but he had a family to feed, and thought he could go back to Poland and provide for his family in that way. Unfortunately, both Nahum's parents, brother and sister, perished in the Holocaust. In 1942, they were sent to death camp Belzec in eastern Poland, where most of Krakowian Jewry perished in 1942. As their romance developed, on Genya's 18th birthday, and I'm going to point over here, this particular ring over here, a very cheap medal, which Nahum fashioned for Genya, and he wrote her initials G.W., Genya Wohlfeiler, her maiden name, and he gave it to her as an expression of his love on her 18th birthday. By the way, Genya has never taken off that ring since then. The war is over. Those of you who have seen Schindler's List, that Russian officer on a white horse comes into the factory, tells them they're liberated, but where do they go? Now, most survivors, and most of the Schindler survivors, took them weeks, but they went back to Krakow looking for relatives, next of kin, anyone that may have survived. And that's where Genya, her mother and brother, went, as well as Nahum. Nahum stayed for a number of months, but he wasn't going to stay in Poland. Left Poland, went to the south, to Italy, and managed to get on one of the illegal boats that were taking Jewish refugees from Europe, trying to break the British blockade to Palestine, to the land of Israel. He arrives there in 1945, joins the Jewish underground, and becomes a wireless operator on these ships, these illegal ships that were bringing refugees to the shores of the land of Israel. Nahum and Genya didn't see each other for 4 years. They wrote letters in Polish, which, by the way, today they've translated, or translating some of them into Hebrew for their children and grandchildren. And it wasn't until December 1949 that Genya left her mother and brother in Poland. Eventually, they also came to the state of Israel. She left Poland and came to the state of Israel, December 1949. On January 17th, 1950, Nahum and Genya were married in that small town outside of Tel Aviv. Nahum fulfilled his vow that he made to Genya in Oskar Schindler's factory. There were hardly 10 people. He had no family. The only family that Genya had was still in Poland. Friends that were part of Schindler's List came to celebrate with them. They don't even have any pictures. This, by the way, is a beautiful piece of video that Genya tells the story when they were liberated and the first kiss he got from Nahum. Let's hear this video.
קיבלתי מנחם. זה היה ביום הולדת שלי, 1945, שנגמרה המלחמה, היינו בבריניץ שנינו, עלינו, היה שם יער קטן על הגבעה, עלינו על הגבעה, ושם בפעם ראשונה הוא חיבק אותי ונתן לי נשיקה.
This is a picture I received from Nahum and Genya. It's the day after the wedding, on January 18th. They went to a kibbutz. As I said, they don't really have any pictures from their wedding. And that's where they lived for a number of years. They went to Beersheba. They had a son, a daughter, children, grandchildren. And they decided on January 17th, the year 2000, this is already 20 years ago. They're now married for more than 70 years. But on January 17th, the year 2000, Nahum and Genya wanted to celebrate their 50th wedding anniversary in the most important place they could possibly think of. In Jerusalem, in a Catholic cemetery on Mount Zion, the gravesite of Oskar Schindler. And they did something that they hadn't done before, because we usually go with Nahum and Genya, the gravesite of Oskar Schindler, on many different occasions with different educational seminars. But at this particular seminar, they decided to bring their 2 children and their 4 grandchildren. And it was there for the first time. If you remember from Schindler's List, the story about the gold ring, and by the way, it's a true story. I know that Steven Spielberg is an excellent film director. He didn't make up the story. They actually took the gold filling from one of the survivors, fashioned a gold ring for Oskar Schindler, and before they parted from him, they gave him this gold ring, that inside the gold ring, they inscribed a verse from the Talmud that says, "One who saves a single life as if he saved an entire world." And they gave that ring to Oskar Schindler. For me, that was a verse from the Talmud. But on January 17th, the year 2000, I saw for the first time, that wasn't just a verse from the Talmud. That was reality. Nahum and Genya, their son and daughter and their 4 grandchildren, it was clear that Oskar Schindler, this one man, he didn't save just 1,200 Jews, but he saved countless future generations. And that's a message to all of us, that each and every one of us can make a difference in the lives of other people. Oskar Schindler decided to spend every single pfennig that he had to save these 1,200 Jews and bring them to safe shores. And in doing so, gave them life and life to their children, future children, grandchildren. A few years ago, I got a very interesting email from Nahum where he said, "We deserve a mazal tov. Our first great-grandson was just born. 4 generations." And I wrote back immediately and said, "Nahum, did you tell Oskar Schindler?" And I got an immediate response from Nahum telling me he was the first to know. Ladies and gentlemen, Oskar Schindler was their redeemer, their savior, and above all, their matchmaker for Nahum and Genya. And this one person was responsible for giving them and future generations life. Thank you very much for listening.
Shalom from Jerusalem. It's wonderful to once again be in the embrace of Father's House congregation. We're talking about survivors tonight, and a very special friend and mentor is the person I want to share with you. In order to do that, I'm going to have to go back before the Holocaust. In fact, I'm going to go way, way back, and not to Europe, but to a neighborhood closer to my own. We all know the story of Lot's wife and how she looked back and was turned to a pillar of salt. Now, whether we see that as metaphor or fact, whether it was that she looked back looking for her girls, looking back to the life that was, seeing the horror, the end product is she was turned to a pillar of salt. For this evening, I'd like you to look at it in just a little different way. For tonight, think of her as being stuck. Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sacks, in his 2015 essay, Haya Sarah, writes, Abraham set the precedent. First, build the future, and only then you can mourn the past. If you reverse the order, you will be held captive. You will be unable to move. You will become Lot's wife. My friend and mentor, Ruth Brand, of blessed memory, is the antithesis of Lot's wife. Ruth was 16 years old when she was sent to Auschwitz with her mother, her brother, and her grandmother. Ruth was the only member of her immediate family who survived. She survived with her cousin, Haya. After liberation, Ruth was convalescing in Sweden when a group of youngsters from the youth group B'nai Akiva came from the land of Eretz Israel to Sweden to convince these survivors to come and help them build a state. This is the story of building that state.
Were sick, who people were poor, and they really helped us in every way. To Sweden also came a group of young people called B'nai Akiva here, and they came to Sweden to help us regain learning, which we were not allowed to learn. I told you we were stopped from learning many years before the war ended. And they came and they retaught us, even though they were needed very much here in Israel. But they came to help us, the remnants of the war. We were the remnants. What they brought us more than anything else was hope. Hope for the future. And they said to us, why are you sad? You're gonna come with us to Palestine and you'll help us. You're going to help us build a country, and then things like this will never happen again. And this really brought us out of our depression. It pulled us out that we saw hope, we saw a light. We're sick, who people were.
But before moving on to help build the state of Israel, Ruth came to New York to visit her paternal grandmother, her aunts, her uncles, to spend some time with them before she continued on the way to her dream. Aunts and uncles and grandmothers weren't the only people that Ruth met in New York. Joe Brand, a young soldier, newly returned from the war, D-Day plus 12 hours, also met Ruth. And for him, it was love at first sight. Ultimately, he convinces Ruth to postpone Israel temporarily and get married and start a life with him in New York. New beginnings, new dreams. And so for the next part of her life, Ruth started making wedding gowns. She gave birth to 4 sons. She continued to look forward. And 25 years and 12 days later, Ruth Brand, Joe Brand, and 3 sons arrived in the land, now the state of Israel. And once again, that original dream became not just a dream, but a reality. Ruth used to tell teachers in the seminars at Yad Vashem a story about making wedding gowns here in Israel. She's making a wedding gown one day, and the mother of the bride says, "You know, you do such beautiful work. How is it you decided to make this your profession?" Ruth says to her, "Well, I wasn't allowed to go to school." And the mother looks at her and says, "In America?" And Ruth says, "Oh, no, I'm not from America." Well, it takes a moment to register, but the mother of the bride looks at her and says, "You're a survivor? You don't look like one." And Ruth says, "It's the first time I discovered I was supposed to have some special look." The mother of the bride says, "But you look so happy." And Ruth says, "Oh yes, my dear new friend, I am happy. Every morning when I wake, I say the prayer Modeh Ani, thanking God for returning my soul to my body, and thanking him for giving me the courage and the strength to marry, to have a family, and to ultimately come to the land of Israel." In 2004, Ruth had an unbelievable experience.
Years ago, and it was a group of 200 officers from the Air Force of Israel. And that I will never forget in my life, never in my life. First I said, when they called me, I should come to join these officers. I said, well, the year before I was in a bus accident in Poland, and I have to ask the doctor if he approves, if I should go. But look for somebody else meanwhile. And she said, no, I heard you speak and I want you to go with this group. And I said, well, take your chances. Then I'm here in Yad Vashem speaking to a group like you. And I asked Ephraim, what is the date that they are going? And when he told me the date, I said, please call her right away and tell her I'm coming. I don't care if I come on 4 or I come in a wheelchair, and I did take along a wheelchair. I am coming. Why? It was the date. The date was 60 years of my arriving in Auschwitz, when in the same night I remained alone from my whole family. And I am coming there not as a slave, not as a slave. I had generals on both sides of me. I had a rabbi with the Torah going into Auschwitz. Going into Auschwitz this time, I didn't come as a slave. I'm in the middle, and with officers who are carrying the flags of my country. And I'm coming with 6 candles that I'm going to light in memory of the 6 million, including my entire family and a third of my people. And that one I will never, never forget.
Ruth doesn't tell you, but the date that her entire family went up the chimney at Auschwitz is May the 18th. In the winter of 1998, I participated in my first seminar at Yad Vashem, and I heard Ruth give her testimony. And when she said the date, May the 18th, I kind of imploded. May the 18th is my birthday. May the 18th is also the birthday of my youngest living son, Timothy. I sat there trying to connect, trying to wrap my mind around the idea that on the day, month and day that I came into the world, that Timmy came into the world, that same month and day, Ruth Brand had lost her entire family. For all of the years that she was able, from that year forward, no matter where I was in the world, Ruth Brand called me on my birthday. To quote once more Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, for each of us, there is something that God is calling us to do, a future not yet made that awaits our making. It is future orientation that defines Judaism as a faith. May God pour out his blessings on all of us. Shalom from Jerusalem.
Thank you so much, Ephraim and Steffi, for your presentations, telling the story of those survivors. That really impacted us. Thank you so much. Just a great shame that you can't be with us, but perhaps you'll be able to come in 2022. We would love to have you here teaching in person. We would learn so much from you. So thank you so much for that. Now, the next part of the memorial service is the presentation of the stories of 4 survivors. Now, we've created banners that you can see here for each of the survivors that we are going to speak about tonight. And those banners are available digitally as well. These are actually an extension of our exhibition here at Father's House. But the digital banners will be online, and you can purchase one of those for a minimum of £10 in order to raise funds for Susan Heagy's ministry with Holocaust survivors in Israel, and also for Rekindle, which was the charity that Lord Carlile founded, which helps young people with mental health issues. Now, these banners here, these 4 banners here, have pictures of the survivors. So we have Evgenia and Zipporah, photographs taken by Grace and Reed last January in Israel, and Renata Calverley and Frederica, who are Lord Carlile's half-sister and mother. And you can buy the digital banners with the story of the survivors from us if you just write to us through our website, and these will be made available to you. And that will be a method of our fundraising. Now, the first of these 4 survivors is Zipporah. And Zipporah, living in Israel today, has an amazing story which is going to be presented to you by Sophie Eassom, who is one of the team members of the children's work at Father's House. So Sophie, I want to thank you for echoing the story of Zipporah, and I look forward to hearing what you've got to say about it. So thank you so much, Sophie.
At the time of the German invasion on the 19th of March 1944, Hungary had a Jewish population of 825,000, the largest remaining Jewish population in Europe. Extreme restrictions were imposed on the Jews soon after the occupation. Between the 15th of May and the 9th of July of 1944, over 434,000 Jews were deported from Hungary on 147 trains, most of them to Auschwitz, where 80% were gassed on arrival. Zipporah Furman was born in Hungary on August 12, 1925, and she was 18 years old when the Germans occupied her country. Even before the German occupation of Hungary, restrictions on Jews had meant that her mother and father were not able to work, and many Jews were already suffering poor conditions and starvation. Children were not allowed to attend schools, and Jewish communities were marginalized. On the 25th of March 1944, German officers forced their way into Zipporah's home and ordered the family to pack 2 suitcases each, hand over the key to their home, and prepare to be taken to the ghetto. Zipporah witnessed Adolf Eichmann supervising the roundup of her community. In the middle of May 1944, the ghetto was evacuated and Zipporah was transported to Auschwitz together with her family. On arrival at Auschwitz, Zipporah remembers seeing Mengele determining their fate. Her father and 14-year-old brother were immediately taken to the gas chamber, but she and her mother survived. Her father's 5 brothers were also murdered in the gas chambers on the day they arrived at Auschwitz. After being tattooed and having their heads shaved, Zipporah said she didn't recognize her mother. Such was the dehumanization process they had undergone. When the Russians liberated Auschwitz on the 27th of January 1945, she recalls Russian soldiers shouting, "You are free, you are free." However, it was not until their illegal entry into Israel, braving the British blockade, that they found true freedom.
Thank you so much, Sophie, for reading that story of Zipporah and introducing her life to us in a very small way, but you read that beautifully. Thank you. And Sophie is a member of Father's House and part of the team, children's team at Father's House. And I'm going to introduce you now to Sophie's sister, Beth, who is going to read the story of Evgenia, again, another survivor looked after by Susan in Haifa. So thank you, Beth.
Evgenia Gorfinkel, Nee Schwartz, was born on the 24th of October, 1932, in Ukraine. She was the eldest of 4 children. On the 22nd of June, 1941, Nazi forces began the invasion of the Soviet Union in an operation called Operation Barbarossa. Evgenia remembers being scared by German air bombardment and hearing people screaming around her. She and her family escaped the attack and found themselves in another district which was occupied by the Nazis, who beat her father. 6 weeks later, she and her family were placed in a ghetto which was surrounded by German and Romanian soldiers. For the rest of the war, Evgenia and her family survived the horrors of ghetto life, including sickness, starvation, and the threat of being burned alive. Evgenia witnessed the guards killing people in the streets, causing her father to become paralyzed with fear and unable to help her family survive. She herself was hit by Romanian soldiers, and she remembers washing and eating potato peelings to survive. The only help the family received came from a Russian Orthodox Christian priest, who, when he could, gave her mother bread for the family. In March 1944, the Red Army liberated the ghetto after a long period of heavy fighting. She witnessed an old family member being killed by the fleeing German forces. After the war, she made Aliyah and now lives in Israel. When she was asked what would you say to young people today, she replied, "I want to tell young people to love people, be patient, to be tolerant, to understand different people, especially when it comes to our country. I want them and any young person to remember that the Germans wanted to kill a whole nation, and we should prevent anything like that from happening again. I want to tell children to keep each other healthy, to help each other, and please think about peace on our planet. Keep peace."
Thank you so much, Beth, for reading that so beautifully, the story of Evgenia. The next Holocaust survivor we're going to hear about is Renata Calverley, and her story is going to be read by Alice Thornhill, who is a student at Carlile School in Hope in North Wales. And Renata Calverley's story is very interesting because it brings us to the build-up of our final speaker, Lord Alex Carlile. And Renata Calverley is a half-sister to Lord Carlile. And her story is fascinating. She's a survivor, and She's written a book which Alice will tell you about. So thank you, Alice, for being prepared to come and tell us this story about Renata, such an important message in our Holocaust Memorial Service on survivors. So thank you, Alice.
Przemysl is a city in Poland which was occupied by the Nazis on the 28th of June 1941. At that time, the city had a Jewish population of 16,500. Immediately after the occupation, persecution and murders of the Jewish population began, and in early July 1942, a ghetto was established, forcing all the Jews to live in a small area of the city. Jews from other areas were also rounded up, swelling the population in the ghetto to 24,000. From there, thousands of Jews were deported to the camps Belzec and Auschwitz, where they were murdered. The German occupation had begun when Renata's father, who was a doctor serving the Polish army, was away. One night, early in the occupation, 3-year-old Renata was woken up by her mother and bundled into the basement of their home. Soldiers forced their way into the house and found them hiding. Renata, her mother and grandmother were taken to the ghetto and crammed into a small room with other Jewish families. The mother and grandmother were forced to work long hours until one day they didn't return home and 5-year-old Renata was left alone. Frederica, a very resourceful Jewish lady, helped Renata escape via various hiding places, facing many dangers and experiencing many hardships. Against all odds, they managed to evade capture. At the end of the war, Frederica searched for Renata's father and found him in Britain, now a widower and practicing medicine. After 6 years of torture and separation, Renata was finally reunited with her father in London. He and Frederica fell in love and later married. Renata went on to study English literature and American studies at Nottingham University. She eventually became the deputy head of Aylesbury High School and on retirement went on to be an accomplished public speaker. You can now read Renata's amazing account on her escape in her book, Let Me Tell You a Story.
Thank you so much, Alice, for reading that story about an amazing lady, Renata Calverley. And I just want to encourage you to get hold of the book, Let Me Tell You a Story by Renata, because it's a fascinating book. And it's a book that can be read by all ages. And it's really important that we learn the stories of survivors from their own experiences. And the book introduces the next survivor, Frederica. And Frederica is actually Lord Alice Carlile's mother. And we're going to hear from Lord Alice Carlile very shortly. But she's an amazing lady. And Frederica is not only a survivor, but she's also a rescuer, because she rescued Renata and others in the Holocaust. And she's an amazing lady. She came to the UK and brought Renata to meet her father. So I won't go any further with her story, because her story is going to be read by Jill Walker of Father's House. But Lord Carlile will also tell you a lot more about his mother, Frederica. So Jill, thank you for reading this story of Frederica.
Let me share with you about Frederica Kastner, whose nickname was Daddy. Frederica was born on the 22nd of August 1914 in Vienna. She was the older of 2 children. Daddy was brought up in a prosperous medical home. Her father, Leon Kastner, was a respected doctor and one of the very first orthodontists in Poland. Her mother's name was Hannah. Tutors were brought in to teach Daddy a number of languages: German, French, Ukrainian, and English. In 1936, she married Friedrich Sophie, whose nickname was Fraser. He was a young neurologist, but sadly Fraser was shot dead right at her side by a German sniper during the Warsaw Uprising of 1944. Her brother Karol had been murdered also by the Nazis in a street incident in Warsaw in 1942. Daddy and Fraser were safe in Lvov until 1941, when the Russo-German pact collapsed. So she and Fraser then escaped with Daddy's brother and parents to Warsaw in a train, which was bombed during the journey. After arriving in Warsaw, Daddy joined the Jewish resistance movement. She dyed her hair from its natural red to blonde and easily passed as non-Jewish. She obtained a non-Jewish false identity, which she kept as her official identity until her death in 2013, aged 97. Frejo mostly hid because he looked very Jewish. Dadie literally had lived by her wits. She was clever with her hands and made and sold rabbit skin gloves, sometimes merely exchanging them for food. She carried messages, provided first aid, and used her strong personality to encourage others. She feared nothing. Dadie arranged the concealment of her parents separately and used her jewelry to recompense their protectors. They survived and lived in Warsaw till their death after the war. She hid and protected Frejo's little cousin, Renata, whose father Erwin had left Poland as a soldier, as a doctor also, in September 1939. His wife Renata's mother, Tosia, was murdered in Auschwitz-Birkenau in 1944. In 1946, through the International Red Cross, Dadie discovered Erwin's survival in the UK. She brought Renata here and reunited them. There was a brief romance and they married. And Lord Carlile of Berriew, CBE, QC, is the child of that marriage. Erwin died in 1989, aged 85, and Renata, sadly very ill, now lives in Peterborough. Just one woman's story of true courage.
Thank you, Jill, for reading that story about Frederica, an amazing lady. And we're going to hear now from Lord Alex Carlile about his mother and the impact of Holocaust on his life. But his life is amazing. I first met Lord Alex Carlile when he was a barrister prosecuting a case in Chester Crown Court, and it was a case involving alternative medicine. And there was no better barrister to prosecute that case than Lord Carlile. And from the moment we heard him speaking in court, I was impacted by him, and he wouldn't know this, but I followed his life with great interest since then, because I knew he would have an impact on our society, and he certainly has. And I'm just going to tell you a few of the things about Lord Alex Carlile of Berriew. He's a CBE in QC. He was born in Wales in 1948. His CBE is for Services to National Security. And actually, because of his advice to governments, we are much safer in the UK than we would have been without him. He is the independent, or was an independent reviewer of terrorism legislation and the independent reviewer of the government's 2011 Prevent strategy. More recently, he was the independent reviewer of the national security policy in Northern Ireland. Now, Lord Carlile was appointed in July 2015 as a member of the Independent Commission on the Freedom of Information. He was also a Liberal Democrat MP for Montgomeryshire from 1983 to 1997. He was the founder member of the All-Party War Crimes Group. Now, one of the things that stood out for me in Lord Carlile's career is the work that he did on the War Crimes Act in Parliament to bring people to justice who had committed crimes during the war, including Holocaust. And it was listening and reading about him in Parliament that made me realize that his mother was a Holocaust survivor, because he quotes his mother in a debate in Parliament. He's also co-founder of the Welsh charity Rekindle, which is a mental health charity for young people who have suffered mental health but have fallen through the net of our National Health Service. And Rekindle are very, very busy helping young people to overcome mental illness. And we are going to be supporting Rekindle tonight, as well as Abundant Hope International. He also holds honorary doctorates of laws from universities in Manchester, Wales, Chester, and Hungary. And he advises governments from all over the world on matters concerning terrorism today. He has done a lot more. What I'm going to ask you to do is have a look at his biography on the internet, because if I was to read his biography, I would have a piece of paper longer than this exhibition. He's an amazing man. He's inputted into our society in the UK more than anyone else that I know. I admire him so much, not only because of his intellectual prowess in terms of law and justice, but actually for his passion to keep us safe in the UK, and clearly his passion for the needs of our young people today, which in today's circumstances are mental health. So Lord Alice Carlile, I want to thank you for taking the time to speak to us tonight. I know everybody is going to be interested in what you say, and we will learn from what you say as well, and understand a little bit more about survivors from the story of your mother and your sisters. So Lord Alice Carlile, thank you again for being with us.
My name's Alex Carlile. I'm a member of the House of Lords and a Queen's Counsel. I've been a member of the House of Commons, and I've been a member of the House of Lords for 20 years. I'm delighted to be contributing to this event. I do so at the request of Mike Fryer, whom I knew a long time ago when he was a highly regarded police officer. His life and mine have changed quite significantly over the years. Mike asked me to offer something to you about my mother. It's a bit more complicated than that, but I will try to focus on her. I was born in 1948 in Rwabon, North Wales. We looked like a very normal family, I think. We lived in a nice semi-detached house. My father was a doctor, and I had an older sister, a half-sister, which begins to tell the story. In fact, we were not an ordinary family. There was a history which leads to what I'm about to say to you today. My father was born in 1904 in or near Przemysl, a city in Poland. He was the son of a small town postmaster. He was clever. He went to medical school and he qualified as a doctor in the 20s. During the First World War, because of the place where he lived, which was in the so-called scorched earth area, he was actually a refugee in Vienna and went to school in Vienna whilst living in the home of some cousins. This made him a great lover of German history and literature, and bilingual in Polish and German. He was a lifelong Anglophile. I suspect that his heart's desire was met, albeit through unfortunate circumstances, when he found himself in the United Kingdom in 1940 as an army medical officer and refugee. He spent the Second World War in the Polish army, running a hospital in Scotland in which they put back together injured daredevil Polish pilots who were flying for the RAF. He was married before the war to a woman called Antonina Glantz, Tosia. They had a daughter together, Renata. Renata is 10.5 years older than me and is the author of a book called Let Me Tell You a Story, which is her story as she remembers it about being a child Holocaust survivor in Poland. In September 1939, my father was ordered to his regiment. They were going to march against the Germans, but they were on horseback. They were a cavalry regiment on horses. They were ordered to march out of Poland into Hungary. Using his medical skills, he made his way across Europe, and he found himself in Scotland in 1940. He had left behind Renata and his wife, Tosia. Tosia was taken, and she died in Auschwitz in 1944. All the other members of the family in Poland died, apart from Renata. Renata, my beloved sister, is now unfortunately suffering from serious dementia, and lives with her wonderful British husband in Cambridgeshire. Renata had to be rescued during the war, so those interested in her thought. And among those who rescued her was a cousin whose name was Frederick Zooswijn. Frederick Zooswijn, known as Fredu, was, as it happened, married to a woman called Frederica, Frederick and Frederica. She was a very resourceful young woman. Fredu and Frederica, who was generally known by the nickname of Duda or Dadi, set about making sure that Renata, or little Renata Renatka, was safe during the war. She was shielded in various houses, the homes of family servants, because middle-class Polish families in those days had loyal family servants, the homes of relatives. Renata was placed in a Catholic orphanage for a time in some pretty awful circumstances described in her book. Eventually, Frederica took her away from the orphanage and hid her herself in various places. Fredu, Frederica's husband, died by her side in 1944 during that year's Warsaw Uprising. Frederica, Dadi, ran away from the Germans, literally ran away from the Germans, carrying her eider down. She escaped, held her freedom, helped in the Jewish underground, such as it was, and was very brave. At the end of the war, her parents, in fact, having survived and indeed spent the rest of their lives in Poland after the war, she, having been educated privately and with many languages, obtained a job as a multilingual secretary in the Polish embassy in Oslo. After the war, she was able, through the Red Cross, to rediscover where Renata's father was, in Scotland. She reunited Renata and her father, Irvin, in London in 1946. There was a whirlwind romance between Irvin and Frederica, Dadi. They married and they had one child. That's me. So that's how we became the family in Ruaben, where I was born, with a 10-and-a-half-year-old sister who was like a second mother to me. Dadi, my mother, was an extremely brave person. It was not unalloyed by characteristics that sometimes made her a little bit tricky. She was formidable. She was intelligent. She knew her own mind, which she very rarely changed. She had high expectations and always said what they were. My father, Irvin, was an extremely clever, very quiet man. Renata and I say that when my mother was difficult, he hummed, and we remember him doing quite a lot of humming. He was, of course, very conscious of what had happened. His parents were dead, murdered. His sister was dead, murdered. His niece was dead, murdered. All the members of his family were dead, murdered by the Nazis, apart from Renata. But he loved Dadi very much. She was glamorous. She was very good at doing things. He became a general practitioner in Burnley in Lancashire. And although he had a very small practice to begin with, he was very successful in building up a very good general practice. When they had no money, we lived in an old doctor's house, which my mother simply made into the most beautiful house in town by making everything from the curtains to the lampshades to the tea towels to our clothes and everything, until she felt that they had enough money to buy things. She then bought things for the home and for herself with a vengeance. She was nothing if not extravagant, but she paid for it all because she had a passion for antique porcelain. And after some years, she started her own business, rather unpromisingly, called Burnley Antiques and Fine Arts Limited. She became one of the national experts in antique porcelain, exhibiting at the great antique fairs all over the country, including London, Harrogate, and elsewhere, and on one or two occasions abroad. She was 10 years younger than my father, and when at the age of 72 he decided it was time to hang up his stethoscope, he then became the very willing office boy in their business. My father, Irvin, who was the most reasonable person I have ever known in my whole life, he never raised his voice to me. The word disappointed used to wound like an arrow. He provided really the very solid stability. My mother provided mothering on a very grand scale. She was a wonderful cook, and I always remember that. And it's always given me rather high standards of cookery, I'm afraid. She was also challenging, as I've already suggested. And I remember my housemaster at boarding school saying to me as a rather shocked 13-year-old boy, one of the things I have to do is protect you from your mother. He was right in a sense. She lived until she was a magnificent 98 and a half. And we looked after her lovingly towards the end of her life, when her mind was razor sharp, as it always had been, but her body had really ceased to function in any useful way. What has this done to me, and what my mother's experience done to me? Well, first of all, at my behest, she wrote it all down. And I and one of my daughters, who I think is particularly interested, are minded to turn it into a book, which my mother started to write. But what she taught me is about resourcefulness. During the war, she lived by making gloves and scarves and things like that for the cold winters, selling them sometimes to German army officers. She had changed her appearance by dyeing her red hair to blonde and could be taken for a non-Jewish Polish young woman. Her husband, Frederick Zuswein, unfortunately looked very Jewish, unfortunately for him, and so he had to be kept in hiding. He spent much of the war being tasked by the resistance, in order to keep him occupied, to translate, bizarrely, Mein Kampf into Polish. She used her resources in order to be able to lead a fairly ordinary life. But she was always in the business of passing information and trying to help people, not just Renata, who needed help. At the end of the war, after she had obtained the job in Oslo and had come here and had fallen in love with Irvin, she defected from Poland via the Glasgow consulate of Poland. She obviously they were not willing for her to defect, but that was where the relevant notifications were given. She and my father married in Perth. They went for their honeymoon to Pitlochry. Renata and I remember being taken to Pitlochry when she was perhaps 15 and I was 5, and being slightly embarrassed by our parents walking around that very pretty town hand in hand. After a short time in Scotland, where my father was running a Polish hospital, as I said at the beginning, they moved to Ruaben, to another Polish community with a hospital at Penley in Shropshire. But then, after a time, my father joined the National Health Service, and that's how we ended up in Burnley, where he was able to obtain a practice. My father very rarely spoke about the war. He had no regrets about being in Britain. The memories of the people he'd lost were too painful to him, and he was a reticent person anyway. He was fully occupied in the care of his patients in his practice, who really loved him very dearly, as became apparent on his death in 1989. Dady, my mother, set about building a new life. I've already said something about her homemaking and her cookery, which included giving demonstrations of Polish cooking in the Burnley gas showroom for the public. She developed her business. She never returned to Poland until 1990, the year after my father died, because returning to Poland was something he really would not allow her to do, but she yearned for it. I met my grandparents only a few times, my grandfather actually only once, when they came to Burnley on an extended holiday, which had been organised by the then Burnley Labour MP, Dan Jones, another Welshman. I was so entranced by what he'd done that even at that young age, I was 7 at the time, I decided that one of the things I really wanted to do in life would be an MP, because MPs could get things like me meeting my grandparents done. I met my grandmother after that visit on a few occasions, mostly in Vienna, where there were mutual friends and 1 or 2 family. But they were quite distant. I was lucky enough to have wonderful godparents from Ruaben, who were kind of honorary grandparents to me, and with whom I often stayed and who were very important in my life. But although my mother did not go to Poland until the year after my father had died, she talked about it a great deal. She had been born in advantage. Her father was a distinguished doctor and dentist, one of the early orthodontists in the then Polish city of Lvov, now Lviv in Ukraine, following the Yalta Agreement, which changed the borders. She yearned for the gracious living of that time, the connections they had, and the troubles they had too, because her brother, Karol, who was killed by the Germans in Warsaw in 1943, had been a student communist and had been imprisoned for it, and it had caused the family difficulties. But she yearned for what Poland might have been, if not for Hitler and the Nazis. In 1990, after my father had died, I and Renata, my sister, took her to Poland for the first time since she had left in 1945. I took her again. They were remarkable experiences. When she first married Fredziu, her first husband, my grandfather, my mother's father, had given them a small block of flats in Lvov as a wedding present, and they lived in one of them and rented out the others and the shops at the bottom. I went with my mother on one occasion to Lvov. She insisted on finding this block. We walked a long way. It was there. We walked in through the swing doors that led into the apartment block of about 8 or 9 flats. And we were standing in the hallway downstairs as she was reminiscing. An old woman came down the stairs. This was actually in 1994, nearly half a century, just over half a century after my mother had left the city. This old woman looked at my mother and she said to her, "Are you the doctor's daughter?" It was an extraordinary incident, which moved me very greatly. And we spent time in her flat meeting people who remembered her family. These memories were precious to her. And what is the message from all this? There's much more I could tell you about my mother and my father, and indeed my sister Renata. But what is the message from all this? Well, the first message was that my father instilled in me how lucky I was to be living in Britain and that I was to be a proper British person. Taught me something about language, probably because I looked so stupid as a baby. They didn't teach me to speak Polish, but I came to understand a lot though eventually they stopped speaking Polish in my presence or even to each other unless they were having a row. Taught me something about language and immigration. My mother, so I am told, had a strong Polish accent. I never heard it. To me, I used to say she sounded like the newsreader Angela Rippon, a good English received pronunciation, but that was just in my ears. It was not the way she sounded to others. She taught me the value of hard work. She was not ashamed of ambition, and when I was occasionally perhaps slightly more ambitious than I should have been, she regarded it as a virtue, whereas not all others thought the same. She thought my becoming an MP was just the most magnificent thing, whereas my father, at least until the last 3 or 4 years of his life when he changed his view, was rather skeptical about how any respectable professional person, particularly one who was doing quite well in legal practice, could take up the job of a politician. But above all, they taught me never to forget, not to forget that relations of ours died as a result of injustice. I hope that they did not die in vain. If there is a soul, I hope their souls are at truly peaceful rest. I think often of my murdered grandparents, Joseph, Johanna, my murdered aunt, Lucia, my murdered great-great-uncle, Isidore, who was known in the family as the wicked uncle because of his gambling habits. Marinia, the nanny who saved Renata's life in a terrible incident when the Nazis raided the flat in which she was hidden with dogs and took away another child and shot the child and the child's mother out in the street immediately afterwards. And Lucia, my father's beloved sister, who would have had a life in normal circumstances very like mine. She was well educated, she was married to a lawyer, and she had all the promise you could have wished for until she became an Unmensch, somebody who was not to be tolerated and was killed for her race and her religion. I'm actually not a very religious person, but I believe whether you are religious or not, the lessons which our families bring, and particularly when you have a powerful mother like I had, the messages which are given and retained by one's mother are of real importance. It's good to remember those messages as we do today, and I thank you for allowing me to share these thoughts with you on this important and lovely occasion. Thank you very much.
Lord Carlile, thank you so much for your presentation. I really value the work that you've done and value the presentation that you've given us tonight, but also thank you for introducing me to Frederica and to Renata so that I can learn and we can share their stories and become echoes of those survivors who tell the story of their lives during Holocaust. So thank you so much, Lord Carlile. Now what I would like us to do is just to spend a few minutes of our time just listening to the music of Ruth Fazell, who plays pieces of music for Holocaust and enables us to reflect on what we've heard this evening. So let's just spend a few moments listening to the music of Ruth and to thinking about what we've heard and what we've learned tonight. Thank you so much, Ruth. That was a beautiful piece of music. Really value your input in our evening, and thank you again. And if you want to hear more of Ruth's music, you can download it from the internet, and you can buy CDs. We've got CDs that we bought years ago of Ruth's music, and it's absolutely beautiful. So thank you so much again. Well, we've come to the end of our Holocaust Memorial Service. I really hope that you've enjoyed it. I'm sure you have. I'm sure that also you've learned a lot about Holocaust and learned a lot about the survivors that today are telling the stories of their lives during a most terrible period in our history. And what our duty is now is to echo those stories and tell our children about those amazing people that survived the Holocaust and have come out of Holocaust, came back into society and inputted into society and gave such a lot when such a lot had been taken away from them. So thank you very much to all who told the stories of the survivors, but also to the survivors themselves, who teach us much about the way that we should live today. A way of speaking kind words to each other, respecting each other, and loving each other, and not using hatred as a tool to create more hatred. So thank you to our survivors in particular tonight. Now, what I'm going to do before I finish is ask you if you would make a donation towards Abundant Hope International, Susan Heagy's ministry in Haifa. And that donation will go towards helping Holocaust survivors in Israel and supporting them in their daily life. It's a really important work that they're doing there. We can't go over to Haifa and do that, many of us. But Susan can be our arms and legs, and she can do the things that we would like to do ourselves and report back to us about what she's doing. And secondly, the other part of your donation will go to Rekindle, the charity that Lord Carlile founded, which helps young people today with mental health issues. And in these times where education is being affected by the COVID pandemic, children are being affected mentally because of the difficulties in being educated online or the uncertainty that this pandemic is creating. And we want to be able to help. We want to be able to support those who are equipped to support those young people. So I'm going to ask you to think about those two charities that we would really like you to donate to, so that we can bless those charities, but also have an impact, not only on the lives of Holocaust survivors who are carrying the history of Holocaust, but also support the lives of those people today, those young people, who will become the educators and the leaders and integral members of our community in the future. So please donate. You can do that by pressing the button on the screen and donating at the end of this virtual service. But now I want to say thank you so much again from Father's House in North Wales. I hope you've enjoyed our Holocaust Memorial Service, and I really hope that next year we can meet in person at Father's House and remember and reflect on the years of Holocaust, so that we will learn never, ever to speak with hatred against people again. Thank you so much for being with us. Good night.